This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Good morning and welcome to the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy and Berman Institute of Bioethics virtual seminar series. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jon Penney. Professor Penney is a legal scholar and social scientist with expertise at the intersection of law, technology, and human rights, with an emphasis on emerging technologies and interdisciplinary and empirical methods. Based in Toronto, he's an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University, a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and a longtime research fellow at the Citizen Lab, based at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Recently, he also spent time as a visiting scholar at Harvard's Institute for Rebooting Social Media. He serves on the advisory committee for the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, the program committee for the Generative AI workshop held annually at the International Conference on Machine Learning, and the steering committee for the Free and Open Communication on the Internet workshop, co-located at the annual USNICS Security Symposium. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jon Penney. Jon, over to you.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I just wanted to say it's great to be here and have this invitation, have a chance to speak with you all. I very much appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to be talking today about something that's near and dear to my heart, privacy interests, but at the intersection of AI and looking at current trends and how we can think critically about the current landscape, about how a sort of broader consensus on how we deal with AI regulation and its implications for privacy. So let me share my screen and I'll get started. So essentially, the title for my talk goes really to that core idea. This is privacy lessons for risk-based AI regulation. And I'll get into what exactly I mean by risk-based AI regulation. Part of what I'll be talking about in terms of the privacy lessons. It'll speak to key developments in privacy research, but also the privacy experience in dealing with many of the same challenges we see in the AI landscape that we've seen in other digital and information security and privacy, information privacy contexts. And what can we learn from some of those past lessons for what we're seeing today and what we're going to see tomorrow in terms of risk-based AI regulation? Now, we've been hearing about the AI revolution for years. And I guess the consensus is that the revolution has arrived, right? So the Washington Post just a few weeks ago, it's arrived in full force. The Oxford Economist just late last year, talking about AI and robots in 2025, the robotics revolution that's been predicted has finally arrived. Yahoo Finance just a few weeks ago, similarly talking about the next stage of the AI revolution being digital labor. And BAE Banking Strategy speaking to how generative AI is poised to transform the banking sector. MNT Technology Review just a few weeks ago, again, speaking to how generative AI, AI chatbots is likely to also revolutionize personal relationships. And it's just a tiny snapshot of the way the AI revolution is now impacting us and impacting all sectors of society. But I'm here to talk to you today about a different AI revolution, the other AI revolution, as I call it. And that's the revolution in regulation. Okay, so maybe not as exciting, maybe not as, at least on its face, as salient and impactful as some of those developments I just mentioned. But in my view, it's something that will have great impact and is having impact today. And I want to focus on. And really, what this revolution in AI regulation has centered on questions of AI safety, both in terms of their harms and their risks. Today, I want to talk about a particular kind of AI-related harm that is the privacy harms, right? And just so we're on the same page, but what I mean by privacy-related harms, some of this is going to be fairly familiar, right? The same questions that we've heard for many years about big data challenges and data governance challenges and mitigating how you handle sensitive data, how you handle personal information, both in other digitized contexts, and now we deal with those same issues in the AI machine learning context today and increasingly in the years ahead. But it's not just those same old data governance issues and privacy concerns that we see. AI, as we've already seen, if you're paying attention to these issues, and something that privacy scholars like myself are happy to inform, and you go to a privacy conference, this is what people are talking about, that AI and machine learning systems are increasing the scale and the complexity of these privacy risks and harms to whole new levels that we haven't seen before. Here's a headline from just a few weeks ago, January 2025. China's new DeepSeek AI, it leaked over 1 million chat logs and sensitive data online. So the same old data leaks and data breaches and concerns we've seen in the past, but at a new qualitative and quantitative level when you're talking about AI and ML systems, about the sensitivity of the information that's being gathered and shared, but also leaked and disclosed in new ways. Part of the challenge with these privacy harms and risks has to do with the fact that people themselves, again, this is an old problem when it comes to privacy, people still don't understand the privacy implications of the choices that they make. So here's another recent story just from January, where it's clear, where people have tracked this, employees, for example, are entering far too sensitive data into generative AI prompts, far too often, disclosing corporate trade secrets, disclosing highly sensitive, intimate personal information, corporate information, all of that. So again, just as we've seen in the past, people don't understand the choices that they make, whether it's, sharing data on social media, sharing information and intimacy in these digital contexts. It's happening also AI, but with greater implications, given the kinds of information and the scales that they're being shared. Of course, beyond that, there are new applications of AI creating new forms of privacy threats, whether we're talking about new forms of AI-driven and machine learning-driven surveillance and tracking, and like facial recognition technology powered by AI, given the threat of Clearview AI, which in 2017, the New York Times reported on, saying maybe this is the company that would end privacy as we know it. Privacy isn't ended. In my view, it's becoming increasingly important, but the threats like Clearview AI and other kinds of new technologies driven by AI are certainly clear and present dangers or threats to privacy and privacy interests. And on top of that, the other concern is a lot of the traditional tools that people would use for privacy and security are rendered less effective and in some cases obsolete. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, like Tor being a tool that's often been used for secure communications and web browsing, that machine learning and AI allows the development of techniques to compromise and render these kinds of techniques really less effective. Privacy still, nonetheless, these threats becoming greater and more complex. Privacy still matters today, matters to human rights, of course. If you're facing a privacy threat due to new forms of surveillance, data being collected about it, or data that you've disclosed to a chatbot being leaked online, it can have great chilling effects. That is, it can chill you from exercising your right, speaking freely, engaging freely, and protesting, which has implications, of course, for democracy and what we do online and what we do offline, what we're willing to engage or speak or share. But it also has implications for personal development. In particular, chilling effects is one of these rights where you need a personal space that's free from data collection, data analysis, penetrating AI surveillance, and data collection analysis and all of that in order to develop our personal identities, to self-experiment, to ask critical questions, and to build long-lasting relationships with our significant others. You need a intellectual space, is something that privacy scholar Neil Richards has argued compellingly. You need intellectual privacy and these kinds of forms of intimate privacy in order for us to develop as individuals. For all these reasons, privacy still matters, notwithstanding these critical developments that we see in society. And what I'm going to argue today is that our current approach to AI regulation, which is based on risk regulation, is ultimately corrosive to these privacy interests. And I'm going to make essentially 4 arguments on that count. The structure of my presentation is going to be in 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about AI regulation, some of the governance trends. Secondly, I'm going to speak to some of those 4 arguments, 4 reasons why I think our current approach to AI risk regulation is a big problem and corrosive for privacy interests. And thirdly, I'll last with some recommendations as to what we can do differently and transform our approach, whether we stick with risk regulation or change our approach more fundamentally in order to preserve privacy in the long term in a world of AI and machine learning. Okay, so let's start with part 1, AI risk regulation and certain governance trends. Now, today, the real revolution, if you want to call it that, which I've been calling that, or at least the key trend, is that there's really been a revolution globally, or a key shift, at least, in how governments are thinking about AI. Right? In 2022, for example, according to Stanford's AI index tracker, there were 37 different AI-related bills passed in 2022 alone. That even increased exponentially, including in the United States, which has notoriously been far more permissive, especially at the federal level when it comes to AI. Well, AI-related regulations in the United States in 2023 grew by 56%, and that these trends have all continued through 2024 and on to, and I think we'll see it also in 2025. There's been a global shift from attempting to understand AI to a focus on both investment and now concerns about AI safety. You see a greater emphasis on both national, more comprehensive approaches to AI regulation, including sector-specific approaches as well. But you see a lot of what I call bootstrapping. That is, there's a focus on AI regulation, but also at least an adjacent understanding that you also have to deal with privacy and you have to deal with information security at the same time. So you see also harmonization of AI regulation with forms of data protection, privacy statutes, and security statutes at the same time. And increasingly what you see is a lot of what I call collaborative governance in this context. The private sector, which today has a lot of the expertise, collaborating with regulatory authorities. That's part of the trend as well. In the end, of course, what we're seeing in a lot of the debates and a lot of the developments in this context is a real tension between AI safety and AI innovation. And of course, you see that today, just a week ago, where you had Vice President J.D. Vance throwing down the gauntlet saying America is going to be focused on deregulating AI and innovating, and in ways treating it as a strategic weapon or strategic asset for global domination and power, right? and warning Europe and warning allies not to go too far down the path of what a lot of the critics of AI concerns about AI regulation is AI safety, right? Europe, on the other hand, has been a real leader on this count, both with the GDPR and the EU's AI Act as well. But that's where you see the tension in a lot of this legislation. But the international consensus really has come down to it's formed around a certain approach, and that is risk-based approaches to AI regulation. Now, you're wondering what exactly is risk-based regulation. Most of you are most likely familiar with it. What it looks like, the FDA is a great example of a risk-based regulatory scheme which is highly precautionary. You've got to prove safety and efficacy before you can go to market. The EPA and other kinds of environmental regulations are often a key example of risk-based regulation. That is, you have to do privacy impact assessments of a new project. You have to look at how it might impact and take steps to mitigate those impacts if you want to move forward to get approval before moving forward on the project. Another example, of course, are design standards. You see that in the automobile context, where you have product safety standards that developers and businesses and product and companies, commercial enterprise need to abide by in order to bring their products to market. So you abide by safety standards. Again, the aim here is to reduce harms and risks later on once those products go to market. Now, generally speaking, the way we might think about risk-based regulation in a global sense, this kind of regulation aims to prevent, reduce, and mitigate risks, like further down the line. Typically, it involves ex ante or precautionary measures like the ones I just mentioned. They're systemic and systematic, often focused on aggregate outcomes, and they're particularly useful for products like AI that are complex, that can be unpredictable, that can be opaque and hard to understand. Unpredictable both in the sense of the technology itself, but unpredictable how people might use it and deploy it and interact with it. So AI is particularly suited for risk-based regulation for these reasons. There are, of course, different tools and approaches for doing risk-based regulation. There's precautionary measures, like I just mentioned, licensing, labeling, design standards. But there's also another approach is risk mitigation. That is, on an ongoing basis, a market player or an actor or an AI developer or firm needs to, on an ongoing basis, analyze the risk of their activities or their products or their tools and technologies and take mitigation measures accordingly. And then you have another set of tools of post-market measures. That might mean ongoing audits, that might mean ongoing impact assessment, or it could mean recalls. If a tool or technology is proven to be too harmful or dangerous, there's a national recall and you got to pull it from the shelves, you got to pull it from circulation. Risk-based regulation can be both command controlled or decentralized. What I mean by that is you could have a centralized, powerful regulatory agency that enforces these rules or enforces, like the FDA, for example. But you can also have more collaborative and decentralized approaches to risk-based regulation, something that you see in the AI context. And that leads me to the next part. So now that we understand risk regulation more generally, what is AI risk regulation? What is it looking like? What is the consensus and what seems to be the approach? Well, there are, of course, varying approaches in different countries, right? You have more precautionary approaches, although, again, I would caution to say not too precautionary, still pretty weak on this count. EU AI Act and the GDPR examples of approaching AI and data-related risks in a more precautionary and more robust fashion, concerned about conformity to or compliance with requirements before going to market. You have the US, which really represents a far more permissive approach, especially at the federal level. Of course, there have been certain statutes like the US Algorithmic Accountability Act, being one that's a little bit more robust and comparable to the EU's legislation, but hasn't been passed. And I'm not sure under this administration will ever see the light of day. or something like NIST's framework or risk management framework, which is essentially self-regulation, right? Just here's some principles, here's some risk management tools and standards, be aware of them. In the middle, you have countries like Canada with the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act that's been tabled and proposed, hasn't yet been enacted, but it's somewhere in the middle. Or the UK's white paper on AI, which again, too, is concerned with risk and mitigating risk, has some precautionary elements, has some post-market and risk mitigation efforts, somewhere in the middle between the American permissive approach and Europe's more robust approach. But generally speaking, we can say that AI risk regulation does seem to have a kind of consensus approach too. It is a lighter touch. It's predominantly risk analysis and mitigation via impact assessments and mitigation duties after the fact. That is, the product's already being used, the AI is already deployed in the wild, it's being used, it's generating new insights, it's generating new data, and you've got to analyze the impacts of what you're doing and mitigate risks accordingly. And that's often almost predominantly delegated to industry actors themselves, right? Similar kinds of risks are being addressed, bias and fairness, core or fundamental rights, like in the EU context, concerns about health, safety, transparency, privacy, security, and data protection, right? And you have a form of collaborative governance, or maybe a better way of saying it, self-supervised compliance. Even the EU, which has the most precautionary approach to these issues and requires compliance with the EU's AI Act before you can go to market, that doesn't mean you've got an independent third-party regulator doing the compliance assessment. Instead, even with the more robust scheme in the EU, it's up to the individual AI firm or developer. They can declare compliance and go to market, right? And then do impact assessments and mitigation steps at a later point. So the reality is AI risk regulation, it's really risk regulation light. It's a lighter touch. It is post-market. It is not really that precautionary. And then I think it really emphasizes innovation and development and use and exploration of the technology, and seems to have less concern about heading off or preventing or preempting AI risks and harms, including privacy harms, at the front end as opposed to the back end. And that means the realities of this technology are this. You've got few prohibitions, few precautionary measures, and even fewer post-market measures like recalls. That has inevitably led to the world that we're seeing today. More data use, more data generation, greater data synthesis, and processing at exponentially greater scales, both to train these AIs, but also to use them and deploy them in society and across new sectors. You've accelerated AI development and use in society and in increasingly intimate contexts like these intimate chatbots, right? Greater complexity, more powerful forms of inference, personalization and surveillance. And all of this is allowed under the current light approach to risk regulation in the AI context. Move these products, use them, innovate, understand, and then understand, analyze, and deal with the misses and mitigate risks at a later point. My argument, and I'll move into part two, is that this approach to risk regulation is corrosive to privacy, and I'm going to make 4 arguments as to why that is. The first is that this current approach to AI risk regulation and risk regulation light is that it leads inevitably to profound forms of privacy-related chilling effects. What do I mean by chilling effects? Well, chilling effects is a concern that certain kinds of privacy threats or privacy risks will have a chilling or deterrent effect on our behavior, right? That it can lead us to be less willing to speak out, to protest, to engage in certain kinds of activities, certain kinds of personal speech, personal communications at home, in intimate settings, but also in society as well. And naturally, it has implications for those things I talked about earlier: human rights, democracy, and personal intimate development. And what we're seeing in recent years with chilling effects theory and research, and a lot of my work has been focused on this, and I have a new book coming out on chilling effects, specifically looking at it in the age of information and AI, where I develop what I call a conformity theory of chilling effects. And what a lot of the new research really shows is that chilling effects, it's been conventionally understood as a kind of rational response to, say, a legal threat or a privacy threat. But what the research in social science shows is that the better way of understanding chilling effects is that it's linked to a deeper psychological states, likely linked to deeper psychological awareness through evolutionary psychology that's comparable to our tendency to conform in the face of other kinds of social threats, right? In fact, my argument is that chilling effects is really a conformity effect. So self-censorship, self-restraints, all of that is essentially a conformity effect in the face of different kinds of threats, including surveillance threats. And if you look at the typical factors that I think the research shows, if you look at typical factors that contribute to or magnify conformity effects, they also magnify chilling effects. So threats of observation and surveillance, uncertainty and ambiguity, personal threats, and greater presence of authority and power, all of these lead to greater conformity. The research shows, also magnify and lead to greater forms of chilling effects. What does this mean? Well, it can mean that we have greater conformity in society, but not necessarily, right? It really depends, which can mean more polite and impolite, more self-restraint, more self-censorship, but it depends on the group norm. It can also lead to extremism and greater polarization and hate and violence and abuse. If that's the norm, that's part of the particular group, well, conforming to that norm can lead to that as well. So it can lead to more muted society and self-censorship, less creativity and dynamism, but it can lead to more extremism, polarization, abuse. And I think we're seeing that today in society. Well, what does this mean? Well, what does this matter when it comes to AI risk regulation? Well, if you look back at those realities of AI risk regulation, more data use, more surveillance, more accelerated use and deployment within society, including facial recognition, including new forms of corporate and commercial applications, be it AI-driven software that's constantly monitoring us and surveilling people within stores, potential shoplifters or other miscreants, being deployed in the US and around the world. But also, of course, greater forms of big data, and today, forms of synthetic data, which I'll mention in just a moment. And if you look at each of those chilling effect factors, surveillance, you get more of it, more data in A, including which leads to more chilling effects. Greater uncertainty. A lot of these complex AI systems and their applications are opaque, leading to the black box problem. That kind of uncertainty and ambiguity leads to greater chilling effects individually and in society. Greater personal threats. Well, AI machine learning allowing for greater forms of personalization in a range of different contexts. Personalization, research shows, leads to greater chilling effects. And two, chilling effects is greater in the presence of forms of authority and power. And today, AI combined with state, corporate, and big tech power is a new kind of even combined power, which can lead again to greater chilling effects. The result is profound chilling effects on an individual level and in society. And recent research by data-valid scholars like Michael Walzer and Mario Buque and Naomi Festick in Europe show that often with chilling effects, it works with forms of normalization that as chilling effects increase, we come to accommodate this new level. And over time, you can never really return to the baseline of freedom or privacy or a place where we can speak and live freely on an intimate level or on a societal level. So there are long-term implications for chilling effects for the way we live our lives today. And the problem, when you look at risk mitigation measures today under the current AI risk regulation light, is that the typical AI risk measures that you see deployed under these schemes are risk analysis and mitigation, after the fact, that is more audits, more privacy impact assessments, and requirements to collect more records, well, that too simply contributes to the problem of privacy risk and chilling effects. There's more records, more data being collected about people, more surveillance and observation of people through audits and assessments, which just contribute to the problem. What about transparency, like the GDPR's requirement to have notices of new forms of data collection or cookies that you encounter on websites? Well, what the research on chilling effects shows is these kinds of notices, making people more aware they're being watched, making people more aware they're being surveilled, simply contributes and compounds the problem even further. AI ethics and risk frameworks, you see like NIST framework and other places being proposed, like AI trustworthiness and other kinds of risk management systems, again, do very little to mitigate and reduce the chilling effect concern. And fourthly, you see often a reliance upon forms of consent, giving more control to individuals. Let people consent to how their data is being used, like you see in the GDPR. Again, this is simply like the GDPR notices. People are simply made more aware, often in complex contexts, which simply leads to more awareness and more chilling effects in the long term. So current approaches and risk mitigation measures do only contribute to the problem, and there's leading to this profound concern around chilling effects and its implications for society. Argument number two. The way things are going with risk mitigation is that inevitably we will be undercutting our core privacy interests over the long term. Why? Because lightly constrained AI and machine learning applications, right? The way they are currently constrained under AI risk regulation light makes data privacy and data protection really, really hard. Why is that the case? Well, of course, as these systems accelerate in their development, there's greater demand for more data, right? And you see litigation between OpenAI and other kinds of AI firms that have simply hoovered up greater amounts of data and information about us in order to develop and train and increase the strength of their models. You see Clearview AI, which essentially collected, in violation of countless privacy laws and countless social media regulations and privacy policies around the world, billions of facial images off of social media platforms online in order to train their facial recognition, AI-driven facial recognition algorithm that they now share with law enforcement and militaries with spotty human rights records, both at home and abroad. So the demand for more data under this current regime that privacy risk assessments do nothing to curtail. That leads to greater big data, but it also leads to demand for new kinds of data, like synthetic data, in whole industries that are centered on the generation of synthetic data. The way you might understand synthetic data is essentially any data that is generated by machines or computers. And the idea behind synthetic data is that it can be used to train and develop AI models without the same privacy risks. But as we're seeing with the power of AI machine learning technologies, even synthetic data can lead to privacy leaks, disclosures, and violations. So the tech is really not there. At the same time, the synthetic data generation industry draws on real data sets. You still need more data collected, more real data shared in order to generate synthetic data. So for demand for synthetic data still increases the scope and magnitude and volumes and velocity of an existing big data, real data about us today. What does that mean? Well, given the scope of AI acceleration, we have supercharged analytics and inference and increasingly powerful forms of inference. Something that Paul Alm has argued that eventually it might be the case that we may be able to, or these machines may be able to infer everything from anything, right? That means increasing encroachment over time on our core privacy interests, be it intimate privacy, intellectual privacy, or chilling effects. More disclosure, more leakage of intimate and sensitive information intentionally and unintentionally. And what this means is that this kind of concern breaks down traditional data categories, like sensitive versus non-sensitive. Dan Solov, a privacy scholar, makes the argument that those categories of preserving sensitive data and non-sensitive break down. If you can infer sensitive insights from non-sensitive data, then we've got a real problem. Not just that, but the current power of these systems, unconstrained and used in the wild without any kind of precautionary measures or prohibitions and the like, just impact assessments and after the fact risk mitigation, our typical modes and methods of mitigation, something I mentioned earlier, are really undermined. Right? So for example, traditional data security and privacy mitigation measures like anonymization and de-identification are rendered far more weak due to the power of these systems. For example, in 2019, researchers built a machine learning system that identified users in anonymized databases, 81% of the time with only 3 records. In 2023, machine learning research used motion data from facial recognition and virtual reality technologies to anonymize fully anonymized users at 94% accuracy using only 100 seconds of motion data. In other words, the things that we've used in the past, certain kinds of technologies and techniques like anonymization to mitigate privacy risks when it comes to privacy and data threats, are rendered ineffectual and weak when we have such a light touch on regulation and risk itself. And even in some cases, mitigating privacy risk is simply impossible with certain models, like large language models. What we're learning is these are powerful memory machines. They never forget the information and data that's been fed into them and used to train them, but also constantly fed into them on an ongoing basis through interactions with users, which, as we saw earlier from one of the headlines, employees and people simply don't understand what you're feeding in is going in. It can never be erased. It can never be misremembered. This has become a problem with, for example, the GDPR, which requires a right of erasure and a right of forgotten, but large language models like ChatGPT simply can't comply. So the second argument is that increasingly the way we're going to inevitably end up with sensitive data being inferred from non-sensitive data, encroachment on intimate privacy, intellectual privacy, and core privacy interests over time, and all the traditional mitigation measures that we've used, technical and otherwise, are rendered weaker and less effectual. My third argument has to do with privacy risks themselves, the nature of them, the fact that they're both latent and complex. And here's a few what I call properties of privacy risks that are salient here. They're often abstract. It's often hard to point to a concrete example of a privacy risk or a harm, other than, for example, a massive data leak. But even when it comes to a data leak, it's hard to show, well, oh yes, you've got sensitive information that's been disclosed without your consent to third parties. But what's the harm of that often? This is something that courts have really struggled with themselves. That is, if you've got a data leak, if you've got disclosure without consent, you've got an increase of future privacy harms. That is, greater privacy risks. But how do you demonstrate that? How do you take that into account when doing risk analysis and harm analysis and mitigation measures? Often privacy threats and risks and concerns are latent. It takes time for them to manifest. They're not going to be salient. They're not going to be concrete. They're not going to be imminent. They're going to manifest in a future point in time. Often they're complex, which you have concerns about intent, consent, people misunderstanding how their behavior impacts on their privacy interests. And often, because privacy is so nuanced and contextual, just depending on you switch certain variables within a given context, that also shifts off the privacy risks, both future and present, in complex ways. And often, as I've mentioned, privacy risks are intangible. It's hard to touch them, hard to hold them, hard to make sense of them. Courts have struggled, and if courts and trained lawyers who think about these concepts have real problems with them, what I would argue and posit is that people working within companies that have been delegated responsibility to deal with these challenges are going to have even harder problems analyzing risk and mitigate them in concrete ways, given these realities and properties of privacy risks and harms. And in fact, as I mentioned before, some of those typical privacy risk measures that have been used were argued recently by Neil Richards and Woody Hartzog. They're essentially all half measures. They really don't address the underlying privacy risks today and in the future. My last argument has to do with systemic privacy problems. And what do I mean by systemic privacy? Well, systemic privacy is really how privacy is dealt within a given system. And that system can be on a sort of group level, but it can also be on a society level. And part of one of my arguments at a more broader societal systemic level when it comes to dealing with privacy practices in a world where we're only using light touch AI risk regulation, well, it's corrosive to systemic privacy practice. Some of this comes from already scholarship that's already been done, like Shoshana Zuboff and Julie Cohen talking about information capitalism, surveillance capitalism. So lightly constrained data use, like you see today under these regulations, lead to greater predictability of people and of things and of society, leading to the development of predictive products, which are exploited for surveillance capitalism. The argument that I've made in relation to chilling effects as well, if we understand them as conformity effects, is that if people are increasingly engaging in conformity due to these privacy threats that lead to chilling effects, again, it makes people far more predictable, leading to and contributing and enabling forms of surveillance capitalism, both today and over the long term, which inevitably leads to corrosive systemic privacy practices, both on an individual level, but most importantly, on a societal level. So let me end with a few ideas of what we ought to do about this. Right? Part of my main argument is that AI risk regulation really shouldn't be risk regulation light. Given the complexity, given the scale and scope and how AI is increasingly being deployed across all aspects of society, how AI, machine learning, and related data is touching more intimate data, more sensitive data, all facets of our intimate lives, our public lives, and our work lives, we need to make risk regulation far more robust. That means not just relying upon impact assessments, that is, risk analysis and mitigation. We need far more robust precautionary measures, including prohibitions on certain uses, including prohibitions on certain applications right from the get-go. We need more aggressive minimization, both of use and data generation. And we need more robust post-market measures, recalls, more robust auditing, more robust third-party assessments for compliance, right? And what does that look like? Well, my argument is going to be we need to reduce uncertainty and ambiguity. That means aggressive government and corporate transparency. As I mentioned, we need more precautionary measures, reducing and limiting, like bans on FRT that some jurisdictions are experimenting with, but other kinds of generalized regulations and clear and bright line rules about certain kinds of data and certain kinds of information is simply off limits for any kind of training, with significant penalties resulting. You need to limit forms of personalization, which again contributes to privacy risks and chilling effects. For example, perhaps you need personalization to be prohibited in certain contexts, like the criminal law context, where greater fundamental interests and risks are at stake. And we need to better constrain power and authority, which too contributes to privacy risks and to chilling effects. That includes more robust antitrust laws and competition laws. At the same time, we need not just data protection laws, which in my view simply continue the same kind of enabling risk regulation light environment. You need clear rules and transparency and no shifting usage. We need fewer notices and fewer prompts and more aggressively enforced data minimization. What is personalization in other contexts, not just in the criminal context? We need non-personalization alternatives. We need fewer consent options and opt-in, and we need more clear, bright rules and prohibitions, as I mentioned. And you need both accountability, oversight, and greater injection of fairness into these contexts. To me, part of the challenge here is that we've simply come up with an approach to AI risk regulation that maybe we're at the first stage and things are going to get more robust, although the conversation doesn't seem to be going that way. Instead, we're keeping things too light, and we need to get robust. We need to get serious fast, or privacy is going to be on the way out, the way everyone has been predicting for a long time. So let me pause there, and I'm happy to take questions and have conversations.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. Folks can feel free to raise their hands or drop their questions in the chat. Maybe I'll go ahead and start since I don't see any hands yet. I mean, you made a comment at one point about the sort of trends in regulation. And that you thought that the trends towards increased regulation would continue in 2025, but then you also acknowledged that we in the US are leading a deregulatory charge. So how do you sort of square those two things? Because it's not just the US, right? We also saw in the meeting in Paris, even the EU starting to question the strength of its regulation.
Absolutely. So that's a great question, Deborah. Yeah. I mean, I think part of this is you're going to see often within national jurisdictions a real wide and diversity approaches depending on the given governmental level, right? So I think the United States, I mean, not to say that it's, the federal level has been robust, it hasn't really been, but at least you had, the Biden administration at least somewhat cognizant of concerns about AI safety with his, executive orders on count, and, concerns about, having AI eventually conform with, consumer protection ordinances and the like. The federal level, it's going to be permissive at least for 4 years and probably beyond at the American level, given the lobbying. But I think you're still going to see leadership at the local level, and you're going to see at the state level. I think California is probably going to lead another California effect, the same way you'll see a Brussels effect, right? So I do think it's true that Europe is going to be taking their foot off the pedal to an extent, now understanding the Americans are going full forward and doubling down on deregulation and AI and innovation. They're going to be concerned about their own competitiveness. At the same time, I do think there's still strong demand for regulation and constraints. I don't think the EU AI Act is going anywhere anytime soon. Neither do I think the GDPR. So I think those ordinances are going to stay, and you're going to see some jurisdictions, including Canada, I think California and other American jurisdictions at the state and local level, that will adopt those kinds of measures. So you'll see a bit of a Janus-faced approach, more permissive jurisdictions, and really a patchwork, which is not going to help a lot of the concerns that I'm mentioning. But I think one of the interesting trends was in the US, you had increasingly permissiveness at the federal level, but you do have an increasing number of AI-related regulations happening at the local and state level. So I think that's going to continue to happen. I mean, I think I'm looking to California, hoping to see that California might be the state that's going to continue to lead, but it's hard to say. So yeah, it's almost like a patchwork we're going to see going forward, which is not going to help some of the challenges that I've mentioned.
Thank you. Okay, I have Rama, then Tony, then Jim.
Yeah, very quickly. I also work a lot with School of Medicine, and historically, medicine folks have been able to preserve data privacy, and it's very difficult to get unauthorized medical data. Even within Hopkins, we have to go through a lot of hoops for me to bring medicine data to engineering and so on. And we are able to do that, but it's very carefully done. So there is a history there in terms of how one would handle data that's private and still be able to progress research and so on. So I think AI can definitely learn from that. The second question I have, when you have 20-year-olds going through your IRS records and Social Security and all of that, this worry about losing privacy for AI is, I'm not sure how to interpret that, right? I mean, yeah. So I think what's going to happen is all bets are off. People are going to do what they're going to do to push AI because everybody looks at China and says, oh my God, they have no worries. They can collect data anywhere, everywhere, and make big AI. And Europe, as you say, is taking the pedal, and I think the same kind of momentum will come to United States. In fact, I was talking to somebody from NIST yesterday. A lot of people are waiting to see who's going to be laid off soon. There's something is cooking there, and that the NIST agency, which was supposed to monitor, etc., is going to go away. That's what. In fact, Elham Tabasi is not there anymore. I mean, Jim may know. That's what I heard, right? So I think these are all things that are going to completely change how we view privacy. I never thought somebody will just go into IRS and be able to look at it, and some who is not cleared, the Doji, whoever these people are. So I think I hate to say this, all our conversation about privacy may become academic soon. It may have absolutely no. It's a scary thing. It's a scary thing, but there are many countries in the world where privacy is not there.
So this is a great point. And let me see if I can counter it somewhat. Because I think you're right. This seems to be the direction that we're going. And why are we having a conversation about privacy and privacy risks when you've got Doge employees sort of ransacking the federal government and trampling on existing laws and privacy protections and all of that. Here's where I'd push back some on why this remains really important, especially to get right on the AI side of things. You mentioned earlier about some of the existing norms and practices within the health sector. I think that's a great point to raise, that you've got in the health sector really strong and robust regulation that's led to greater carefulness and duties. And I've got friends who work in the medical context, and in ways they complain about, some of the regulation, the concerns they have to deal with. At the same time, they'll admit that it's led to, careful innovation and development and use. You still get innovation, but it's done in a careful way. And that took both regulation in order to create that culture of responsibility and carefulness in respect of privacy and data protection within health research, and which is carried over into AI and its development. What you're seeing that's happening with Doge is you've got computer scientists and actors coming from an entirely an industry, whether it's being Tesla, SpaceX, which are using AI, that it's the Wild West right now. For the reasons that I've mentioned, there's this entire premise that if they take what they like, they analyze what they like. There's no constraints right now on what Tesla's doing with AI, what SpaceX does with AI, and a lot of these other companies, right? And so they're coming from a culture of unconstrained thoughtlessness and recklessness, really, with data. And they're taking that and carrying it over to the IRS, to the Treasury Secretary, to Social Security Administration. And if you had better constraints and regulations on the AI industry to develop those norms that you mentioned in the health context, I don't think you'd see the same thing. So I think what we're seeing right now is a product of this lackadaisical approach to privacy within the AI industry and its light touch approach that's just simply being carried over and ported in ways or transplanted to a context where it's in violated norms that we would expect of privacy and security and data protection and Social Security and the IRS. And so the question is, do we give up on privacy? No, I'd say we need to develop more robust constraints in that context so we don't see that kind of reckless behavior being transplanted to other industries. Maybe you see the cat is out of maybe the genie's out of the bottle, the cat is out of the bag, what have you. I don't think so. I think what we're seeing now, I think really shows the need to accelerate our focus on privacy risks and it's focused on the AI context.
I
But I
think
agree,
we'll
this is,
continue the conversation, but because others have questions. AI did not spoil these people. These people have an agenda. They're, privacy. They want to take the data and make AI better. So, I think you are being a very optimistic person. I appreciate that, but that's not how I see it. Actually, I see it the other way, that nobody's going to care anymore because there's nothing much happening. People are just doing what they're doing right now, at least at the federal level in US. So it is going to get only worse. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rama. Tony?
Thanks, Deborah. Hi, John. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm Tony DeBora. I'm co-director of the Institute for Assured Autonomy here at Hopkins. You talk about reducing uncertainty in AI-based applications. Through my own work, I argue that the primary ways to reduce uncertainty in AI are to essentially reduce the amount of AI that you're using through guardrails or in small-scale applications where you probably didn't need AI in the first place. So it becomes paradoxical, and I'm wondering what your views are on reducing uncertainty, because it's a lot easier said than done.
so that's, Tony, thanks for that. That's a great example, and in fact, something that I will be citing going forward. I mean, I'll follow up with you after the talk.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, because the research shows when it comes to privacy risks and related outcomes like chilling effects and privacy threats and harms in the long term, reducing these forms of ambiguity and uncertainty is one of the things you need to do. But how do you do that in this context? And the one that I often cite is the one that I mentioned in the slides, where we need greater explainability and transparency to reduce the ambiguity about uses, all of that. But I think at the same time, you need, exactly as you say, what can reduce uncertainty and ambiguity is more aggressive minimization. Now, what I've often talked about, and I had it at the slide near the end, I didn't talk much about it, is something privacy scholars talk about all the time, is data minimization, right? Which means reducing the amount of data you need to collect and use for the purposes that you need it for. So you got to justify your collection or use and processing of it. And any excess data is, there's guardrails. You can't take more than what you need. And if you do, there's penalties attached to it. So I've often talked about aggressively enforced data minimization. And that includes both on the input and output side. That is AI, like generative AI, that's generating new kinds of data, right? So strict constraints on data minimization in terms of output, but also input, what you need to train these models. It's not just hoover up all the data and throw it in, which seems to be the current approach, but being more aggressive about what you really need to train this AI or model for this specific task. All of that should be clear. There should be bright lines and rules around that. I think what you've offered is another great example. So it's not just data minimization, but use minimization. What is your task? What is your aim? What is the model that you're using? And use should be also minimized as well, for the same reason data minimization needs to be deployed more aggressively too. So that's a great example. I'm going to be using it and citing it. And I think that's one way I think we can reduce uncertainty and ambiguity in this context. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you. Look forward to talking to you more.
All right, Jim, you get the last question.
Okay, so Jim Bellingham, I'm the executive director of the Institute for Assured Autonomy. I actually come from a marine robotics background, where I worked a lot in the climate science arena, and so I see some parallels here. I mean, this is another area where the science results drive you towards answers which seem at odds with basically economic drivers. And so that's been a big struggle. That field has been highly politicized for decades now as a consequence. And so I want to just sort of bounce a couple of different strategies that community has tried. I'm not going to argue they're horribly successful, but it's worth having a conversation about other ways to approach this. One was finding alignments, and so if you can create a profit motive for example, reducing carbon consumption, this whole idea of carbon markets, which was a very hot topic about, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago. That definitely generated, I can remember in the oceanographic institutions, we got large numbers of visits of high-flying investors from Wall Street at that period. It ended up sort of existing in bits and pieces. So it had an impact, not the impact folks hope. And then the other one really revolves around, which was much more effective in the last 4 years, were SEC reporting requirements. So it didn't actually legislate anything other than they had to be open about what their carbon impacts were. And it turned out shareholders care about that. And they had that probably had the biggest impact of everything. And so I've been kind of nudging folks to think about the boardroom and reporting requirements for publicly traded companies as a mechanism for, number one, it provides transparency. The fear is all of this stuff gets swept under the rug. But number two, it gives people a realization of what those companies they're investing in are actually doing or not doing. So I kind of am curious about how you would sort of see that, playing in sort of the ecosystem that we need here ultimately.
Again, so this is fantastic. One of the things I love about having conversations in interdisciplinary institutions like this, people coming from different backgrounds and different practices and institutions, and thinking about this in their own context, give great ideas for dealing with these privacy problems. I mean, inevitably the reality when it comes to privacy, and you'll hear this from privacy scholars, but those who are concerned about AI regulation is, privacy can't just be dealt on its own. It's got to be dealt with like AI risks and harms more generally in an interrelated and systematic way. So it's not just going to be a privacy statute that's going to get it done. It's going to be AI risk regulation with privacy statutes, but also thinking more systematically with what you would call sort of alignments, right? Or we've talked about this in the AI context, the alignment problem, aligning design of AI systems with human values, right? Whether it being privacy or speech and freedom and equality and fairness, all those things. But I think what you've given are two great examples again of increasing transparency in a way that actually reduces the privacy risks and harms that I've talked about. I mentioned some of the existing kinds of mitigation measures like privacy notices or prompts for consent. Those things which leave the burden on individuals, where you receive this notice saying, this data about you is going to be collected. You don't know why. It'll say it's going to be useless. You don't know how long it's going to be kept, all of that. Or simply notices about what's happening, leaving to the person who really doesn't understand the context. It's going to just lead to greater privacy harms and chilling effects in these contexts. Or there's no risk mitigation, that people don't understand the notice and just go ahead and accept it and move forward, leading to the risks down the road, which are latent and abstract, all those things. You've given a great example, both aligning values, but also the reporting requirements, which is done at a sector level or structural level or societal level, which provides more information. So it's not just individuals, like who's going to be looking these things up. It's going to be groups. It's going to be activists. It's going to be shareholder institutions, like institutional actors with the expertise and know-how who do care about these things and will hold these companies' feet to the fire. If they've got to report more on if it's not climate practices, in this case, it's going to be their privacy practices. And so I think, again, you've provided, another example of something that can change that I will be citing that I think leads to reduction in uncertainty and ambiguity, which will lead to fewer privacy risks and AI harms in the long term. So I thank you for it. And it's exactly this kind of thing we need to do in a more systematic and structural way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, we're going to have to wrap there, but please join me again in thanking Professor Penney for his talk today. And
Thanks,
thank you all
everyone.
for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for the great turnout. So I switch over to the other.
Correct.